Sold for $1 to the kid who apparently wants a pile of rocks. The whole room laughed. Dawson Locke had a duffel bag, a coffee can of quarters, a dollar bill folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth. That dollar just bought him a condemned lighthouse nobody else wanted. Nobody in Cormorant Point knew a dead man had spent 40 years filling an account with that boy's name on it. Nobody knew a federal grant sat buried in a courthouse drawer. Same last name Dawson carried, and he never knew why. In 6 weeks, a developer would watch his own contracts turn to nothing. He'd already spent $86,000 he didn't have. It would happen in front of the whole Harbour Commission. A logbook would fall open on a folding table. A boy who'd spent his whole life being nobody's would find out he'd been somebody's the entire time. He didn't say a word when it happened. He just climbed the stairs. But before the stairs, before the folding table, there was the auction. And there was the laugh. The county building on Wharf Street had one working radiator and a floor that groaned under folding chairs. 19 people sat in rows. They faced a card table where the auctioneer worked through index cards. His name was Purdy. He ran cattle and property both. Griff Talbot sat in the front row. Canvas jacket. Cost more than most of Cormorant Point's boats. His phone lay face down on his knee. His lawyer sat beside him, a leather folder unopened on the seat. Dawson stood in the back, 18 years old. Hair he'd cut himself with clippers borrowed from the hardware store. Boots with the left sole starting to separate. He'd walked the 2 miles from the store. The truck he sometimes borrowed needed gas he didn't have. Parcel 4, Purdy said. Cormorant Point Light Station. Structure condemned 2019. Half acre. Federal easement attached. Tower non-operational since '84. County's asking opening bid. Back taxes only. $612. Nobody moved. A woman in the third row laughed under her breath. Talbot's lawyer leaned and murmured something. Talbot nodded slow, like a man already counting money he hadn't made yet. 600, Talbot said, raising 2 fingers. Purdy wrote it down. 600. Do I hear more? Going once. $1, Dawson said. The room turned. Purdy's pen stopped. Son, the opening's 612. You can't bid $1. Not the opening bid. I'm buying the back taxes, note the county posted last month. Dawson held up a printout. County seal at the top, corner soft from being folded in his pocket for 2 weeks. Says here anyone can settle a lien for $1 over assessed value. Property just has to be condemned and abandoned longer than 5 years. It's abandoned since 2019. That's 6 years. Purdy took the paper, read it twice. His mouth twitched like he wanted to argue and couldn't find the ground to stand on. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Somebody in the crowd laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh a room gives a joke it didn't expect a kid to be in on. Talbot's lawyer was already flipping pages in his own folder. Purdy read the ordinance number twice more, held it up to the light like it might change, set it down flat. Says right here, Purdy said half to himself. Lion's satisfaction clause. County Code, section 41-6. Damned if it doesn't say $1. Talbot leaned to his lawyer. Is that real? It's real, the lawyer said, low, not looking up. It's old, nobody's used it in a decade. He found it. Sold, Purdy said, and the gavel came down before Talbot's lawyer could finish standing, for $1, to the kid who apparently wants a pile of rocks. Laughter again. Bigger this time. The kind that fills a cold room because everyone needs somewhere to put their nerves. Talbot didn't laugh. He watched Dawson walk to the table and sign where Purdy pointed. Watched the county clerk stamp a receipt. Watched a kid who owned nothing on earth become the legal holder of a half-acre point of rock. And a 130-year-old tower that used to warn ships off the ledge before it went dark. Dawson folded the receipt into the same pocket the ordnance had lived in. He didn't smile. He'd learned a long time ago that smiling too early was how you got hurt. Outside, the wind off the water cut through his jacket like it had something personal against him. He walked the breakwater road instead of catching the bus. It was free, and he wanted to see it. The lighthouse stood at the end of the point, whitewash gone grey, one window boarded, the iron gallery rail orange with rust. A chain-link fence ringed it, sagging in 2 places where someone had already cut through for scrap or dares. A sign zip-tied to the gate read, "Condemned, do not enter." The letters faded to the colour of old teeth. Gulls worked the ledge below it, riding the wind sideways, indifferent to the sign and everything it claimed. He stood at the fence a long time, long enough that his hands went numb in his pockets, long enough that Walt Pruden, closing up the bait shop on the pier, saw him from 200 yards, squinted like he was looking at a photograph he half remembered. Dawson had grown up in 6 houses that weren't his, and one group home that definitely wasn't. He'd learned early which kids in a new placement wanted a friend, which ones wanted a punching bag with a bunker sign to it. He'd learned to keep his stuff in one bag, packed. You never knew when a caseworker would show up with a new folder and a new address. He'd learned to fix things: a running toilet, a stuck window, a bike chain. Fixing something quietly made you useful, and useful kids got to stay a little longer than the ones who just needed things. He'd aged out 9 months ago, on his 18th birthday. The state handed him a check for $400 and a pamphlet about community colleges. That had been that. 6 placements, 0 families, 1 skill: fix what's broken before somebody notices it's broken. The hardware store gave him the stockroom to sleep in. $40 a week, off his wage. No questions asked. Ansel, who owned the place, had aged out himself once decades back. He understood the arithmetic of it better than most. Nobody in 19 years had told Dawson he belonged to somebody. He carried a roll of electrical tape in his jacket pocket at all times, for no reason he could explain. An old habit from some placement he barely remembered. Some house where somebody had handed him a roll of tape and said, "Fix what you can, kid." He'd never stopped carrying one since. He put his hand on the chain link, and the fence rattled cold under his palm. "That thing's been dead longer than you've been alive," Walt called from the pier, voice carrying over the water. "What did you want with it?" "I own it now," Dawson said. "Bought it today." Walt Pruden had a face like driftwood, all the soft parts weathered off decades back, pale blue eyes that had spent 40 years staring down fog. He came down the pier slow, favouring the knee that had never healed right since a winch line took it wrong in 91. "You bought the light station," Walt said. Not a question. More like he was trying the words out to see if they made sense in his own mouth. Dollar and back taxes. Talbot wanted it. Something about the code let me get there first. Walt's jaw worked once like he'd bitten something without meaning to. "Talbot," he said. "That figures. He's been sniffing around this point since spring." He looked at Dawson a long moment. The kind of look Dawson had learned meant an adult deciding whether you were worth their time. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight, kid?" "Hardware store stockroom." "Ansel lets me. All right." Walt turned back toward the pier, then stopped, half over his shoulder. "You ever hear the name Silas Locke?" Dawson's stomach did something small and strange. "That's my name. Locke." Walt didn't answer that. He just nodded once, slow, like a man filing something away he wasn't ready to open yet. He walked back to the bait shop without another word. Dawson stood at the fence until the light went the colour of a bruise over the water. Then he walked back to town. The stockroom was warm and free. The lighthouse, his lighthouse now apparently, wasn't going anywhere. He didn't know yet that Griff Talbot had already spent $86,000 of a deposit he hadn't earned. 2 men in Boston had wired that money against a view lot that didn't legally exist yet. Land Talbot didn't legally own yet. A bet Talbot had been sure was as good as signed. He didn't know that a name he'd never heard sat printed neat in a federal document. In a courthouse drawer 2 towns over. The same last name stitched inside the collar of the one shirt his mother had ever left him. He only knew the light was his, and it was falling down. Something about it made him want to walk out there every night and check the padlock. The way you check on something you're afraid to lose before you've even let yourself want it. That first night he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the fence, the way it had rattled cold under his hand. The way Walt's face had gone somewhere else at the name Locke. He told himself it didn't mean anything. Coincidences happened. Locke wasn't a rare name. He told himself that for exactly 1 day. The next evening, after his shift sweeping and stocking shelves for Ansel, Dawson walked back out to the point. He skipped the stockroom entirely. The gate had a heavy padlock threaded through the chain. County issued, the kind that took a key nobody living had a copy of. He checked it out of habit, tugged it once, made sure it held. Then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He found the gap in the fence where the chain link sagged, the same gap kids use for dares, and he went in. Up close, the tower was worse than it looked from the road, and better too, in some way he couldn't name. The whitewash had gone to grey scab in patches, but the stonework underneath was solid. The kind of stonemasons don't cut anymore because nobody pays for it. A door at the base, iron-banded, had a rusted padlock of its own, older than the county's, hanging half broken off the hasp. He crouched at the base of the tower, where a course of stone met the foundation. That was when his hand found the grate. It was iron, maybe 18 inches square, set flush into the stone at ankle height. The kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times without seeing, unless your fingers happened to catch the edge of it in the dark. Years of salt had rusted the frame thin. He worked his fingers under one corner and pulled. It came up easier than it should have, like something wanted it to. Behind it was a cavity maybe a foot deep, dry despite everything, lined with what looked like tar paper gone brittle and dark. Inside that, wedged tight, was a bundle wrapped in what had once been a rubber slicker, tied off with fishing line. Dawson sat back on his heels with the bundle in his lap. His heart was going harder than the cold explained. He didn't open it there. He wrapped it back in his jacket and walked the half-mile back to town in the dark. He sat on the edge of his cot in the stockroom, door locked before he untied the fishing line. His hands weren't quite steady. Inside the rubber wrapping was a book, a ledger, cloth-bound, the kind a keeper would use to log wind and weather, and the hours the lamp burned. The first page was dated in a hand gone thin with age, 1971. The name at the top, written in fountain pen, blue ink faded to the colour of an old bruise, S. Locke, Keeper. Dawson sat very still. He turned the pages slow. Weather notes. Fuel consumption. A boat in distress logged in November of 76. Saved 3 souls. No further detail. Every so often in the margins, notes that weren't about weather at all. A line here about a daughter born in town. A line there about a daughter gone quiet, gone distant, gone somewhere he didn't follow. Near the last third of the book, a name that stopped Dawson's breath cold in his chest. Marisol. Gone to Portland. Won't say who. Won't come home. He didn't know a Marisol. He'd never heard the name in any placement, any file, any caseworker's mouth. But something about the shape of it sat wrong and right at the same time. Like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. The very last entry in the ledger was dated 1984. The year Walt had said the light went dark. It read only this: "The light goes dark before the harbour forgets who kept it safe. Whatever they do with the tower, the account stays. He'll come for it when he's ready. Not before." Dawson read that line 4 times. He had no idea who he was supposed to be. He had a bad, hopeful, terrified feeling he already knew. He didn't sleep that night either. He lay on the cot with the ledger under his pillow, like a kid half his age would do with something precious. He listened to the pipes tick in the stockroom. He thought about a fence rattling cold under his hand, and a man named Walt saying a name like it weighed something. In the morning he went looking for Walt before his shift. The bait shop smelled like brine and diesel, and the particular must of nets that never fully dried. Walt was behind the counter sorting lures into a tackle box when the bell over the door rang. "You found something," Walt said. Not a question. Dawson set the ledger on the counter between them. Walt looked at it a long moment before he touched it, the way a man looks at a photograph of somebody he buried. Where? Grate at the base of the tower, behind a hollow in the stone. Walt picked the ledger up with both hands, like it might come apart. He opened the cover and went still, reading the name written there in fountain pen. His throat worked once. "S. Locke," Walt said. Low. "Silas Locke. I served under that man 11 years. Last keeper Cormorant Point ever had before the Coast Guard automated the light." He turned a page, then another. Slower now. This is his hand. I'd know it anywhere. He used to write the weather report so neat you'd think a machine did it. Then he got to anything that mattered to him, and the letters got big and messy, like his hand couldn't keep up with what he was feeling. "Was he my grandfather?" Dawson said. He hadn't meant to ask it that plain. It came out anyway. Walt looked up at him with an expression Dawson couldn't read, something between grief and relief. "I don't know for certain," Walt said, "but I know Silas had a daughter named Marisol. She left Cormorant Point pregnant and scared around 1990. He never talked about her again after that. Not once, not even drunk. And Silas Locke was a man who talked about everything when he was drunk." He set the ledger down gentle, like putting a sleeping thing to bed. "And I know your last name is Locke. I know you showed up in this town 9 months ago from a group home 2 counties over. I know you walked right up to that fence like it already belonged to you before the county ever said it did." Dawson's hands had gone cold on the counter edge. He wrote something, Dawson said. Last page. About an account. Said he'd come for it when he's ready. Walt turned to the last page and read it himself, lips moving slightly the way older men read things that mattered. The light goes dark before the harbour forgets who kept it safe. Walt read it aloud, then went quiet a long moment, staring at nothing. He said that to me, word for word. The night the Coast Guard shut the light down for good. 1984. Standing right where you're standing now. Half a bottle of something cheap already in him. I asked him what in hell he meant by it. He just looked at me like I was supposed to already know. He never said it again. I never asked again. I forgot about it for 40 years until you just said it back to me in my own shop. What account? Dawson said. I don't know, Walt said, and that much at least seemed true. But Silas worked the harbour unofficial for 4 decades after they took the light from him. Towed boats, fixed traps. Never took a full wage for any of it, just cash here and there. Favours mostly. Man had to be putting something somewhere all those years. Nobody ever asked where. Nobody figured he had anywhere to put it. Dawson thought about the ledger's cavity, the tar paper lining, the way it had been built to keep something dry for a long time. There's more, Dawson said. Has to be. He wouldn't hide a ledger just to say that and nothing else. Walt closed the book carefully and slid it back across the counter. Then you best go find it, he said. But watch yourself out there. That tower's been condemned 6 years for a reason. And Griff Talbot's not the kind of man who loses $86,000 quiet. How do you know what he spent? Walt's mouth went thin. Because his lawyer drinks at the same bar I do on Fridays. Lawyers talk when they've had 4 beers and think the room's empty. Talbot pre-sold 2 lots off that point to some money men in Boston before he ever owned an inch of it. Contracts contingent on him winning the parcel at auction. He was supposed to walk in yesterday and buy it for $600. Walk out today already rich on paper. Walt shook his head slow. Man's going to be looking for a way to get it back. You keep that ledger somewhere safer than a stockroom, you hear me? Dawson nodded and tucked the book back inside his jacket against his chest. He could feel its weight the whole walk back to the hardware store. He worked his shift that day with his mind 2 miles out on the point, restocking screws and paint cans while his hands moved on their own and his thoughts kept circling back to a name. Marisol. A woman who might be his mother. Who'd left this town scared and pregnant 30-some years ago. Who'd never once come back. Not for a birthday, not for a caseworker's call, not for anything. He'd been in the system since he was 4. Nobody had ever told him much about where he came from. A mother who couldn't keep him. A father who was never named on any form he'd seen. A string of relatives who either didn't want him or didn't exist. He'd stopped asking around age 9 because asking only ever got him a folder pushed a little further down a stack, and a caseworker's tired eyes saying maybe next year, kiddo. He hadn't let himself want an answer in a long time. Wanting things you couldn't have was how you learned to hurt yourself on purpose. That evening he went back out to the point before the light failed completely. He climbed through the same gap in the fence and stood at the base of the tower. The county's rusted padlock hung useless on its broken hasp. He stared up at the iron-banded door. He'd need better tools than the ones in his pocket to get that door open properly. But there was another way in, if you were willing to climb. Dawson Locke had spent his whole life learning to get into places nobody wanted him getting into. A service ladder, rusted but bolted deep into the stone, ran up the seaward face of the tower to a maintenance hatch near the gallery. He tested the first rung with his full weight before he trusted it. The way you test ice. It held. He climbed slow. The wind picked up the higher he got. Salt air bit at his eyes. The harbour spread out grey and silver below him, like something he'd never let himself want before today. Near the top, the hatch had a simple slide bolt, rusted but not welded. It took him 10 minutes of working it back and forth with the heel of his palm before it gave. Inside, the lamp room was dark and close. It smelled of cold metal and dust that had sat undisturbed since before he was born. The lens housing sat dead centre, a great glass drum gone milky with grime, the brass fittings around it green with verdigris. A federal notice, yellowed and peeling, was still taped inside the door, the seal date printed clear even after 4 decades. Sealed per USCG order, 1984. Dawson stood very still in that small round room. He felt, for reasons he couldn't name, like he was standing somewhere sacred. He ran his hand along the base of the lens housing, feeling for anything that didn't match. The way he'd feel along a wall at the hardware store checking for a stud. Most of it was solid brass and iron, cold under his palm. But near the back, low, one panel gave slightly under pressure where the others didn't. He worked his fingers into the seam. The panel was held by 2 screws gone to rust lace. Barely any pressure, and they crumbled, and the panel swung free on a hinge nobody had oiled since Nixon was president. Behind it sat a strongbox. Army green, padlocked, small enough to carry under one arm. Dry as a bone despite 40 years in a sealed room by the sea. Dawson's hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. He carried the box down the ladder against his hip, one careful rung at a time. He walked the half-mile back to town in full dark, holding it against his chest like something that might wake up. He didn't open the strongbox that night. He set it on the floor beside his cot and stared at it a long while. The padlock caught the one bare bulb's light. He told himself he'd wait until he had a proper key, or a proper reason, or maybe just until he wasn't afraid of whatever was inside it. He fell asleep with one hand resting on the lid. In the morning, Ansel found him already awake, sweeping the same aisle he'd swept the day before. Ansel said nothing about the dark circles under his eyes. He had a rule about not asking questions a kid wasn't ready to answer, learned the hard way from his own years in the system. He lived by it strict. Word of the auction had gotten around town faster than Dawson expected. By mid-morning, 2 customers had already asked him, half joking, whether he planned to live in his lighthouse. By noon, Griff Talbot's silver truck pulled into the hardware store lot. Talbot himself walked in wearing the same canvas jacket from the auction, a smile stitched on that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Dawson, right," Talbot said. Extending a hand Dawson didn't take right away. "That's right. Quite a find yesterday. Section 41-6. I've been buying property in this county 11 years. Never once heard of that clause." Talbot's smile held steady, professional. The kind that had closed 100 deals and meant nothing personal by any of them. "I want to make this easy for you. You're 18. You don't need a condemned tower and an environmental headache. I'll give you $5,000 for the parcel. Today, cash, and you walk away clean. It's not for sale." Talbot's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. $10,000, Talbot said. "That's more money than you've probably ever held at one time." "I mean that as a fact, not an insult." "It's not for sale," Dawson said again, quieter. The way he'd learned to say things when he needed them to be final. Talbot studied him a long moment. The way a man studies a lock he's about to try a different key on. "You know what's out there, don't you?" Talbot said. Not quite a question. "Somebody told you something?" Dawson said nothing. He'd learned that too, a long time ago, in rooms with adults who wanted things from him. Silence cost you nothing. Talking gave something away every time. Talbot's smile finally cracked, just at the edges. 15,000. Final offer. After that, I stopped being friendly about this. "I'm working," Dawson said, and turned back to the shelf he'd been stocking. After a moment, he heard Talbot's boots on the linoleum, heard the door chime, heard the truck start up outside and pull away too fast for the lot's gravel. Ansel came around the end cap a minute later, arms crossed. "That the developer?" "That's him. He offer you money." 15,000. For the point. Ansel made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "Kid, whatever's out there, it's worth a hell of a lot more than $15,000. Not if a man like that is climbing that fast on his own number." He clapped Dawson once on the shoulder, gentle. "Don't sign anything. Not for him, not for anybody. Not without somebody looking at it first who isn't trying to get something from you." That night, Dawson finally opened the strongbox. He used a screwdriver from the store, working the hasp until the old padlock's shackle gave. The snap felt louder than it was in the quiet of the stockroom. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, were 3 things. A logbook, smaller than the ledger, bound in leather, filled front to back in the same fountain pen hand. A savings passbook from a bank 2 towns over. The kind with a paper register glued inside the cover. Entries running from 1985 all the way to a final one dated 3 years ago. The year Walt had said Silas finally passed. And a sealed envelope, yellowed, addressed in that same careful, aging hand to a name that made Dawson's chest go tight and strange. For Marisol's boy. When he's old enough. When he's ready. Dawson sat on the edge of his cot, holding that envelope a long time before he could make his hands open it. Outside, somewhere down the block, A truck downshifted on the hill. A dog barked twice and went quiet. For a moment, the ordinary sounds of the town felt like they belonged to a life that was already ending. The paper was thin, brittle at the fold lines, the ink gone the colour of weak tea. Dawson unfolded it under the bare bulb and read it twice before the words fully landed. If you're reading this, I never got to say it out loud. I'm sorry for that more than anything else I ever did wrong. Your mother was the best thing I ever helped raise. I let her walk out of this town scared and alone because I was too proud and too stubborn to chase her down the road. Too stubborn to tell her it didn't matter to me who your father was or wasn't. I let a whole harbour's worth of pride cost me my own daughter. I have regretted it every single day since, and there's no fixing that now. I started an account the year she left in case she ever needed it, in case you ever needed it. I kept adding to it every year I worked this harbour. Towing boats, fixing traps, doing whatever paid. It was the only thing I knew how to do for a grandson I never got to hold. I never told the bank why. I never told anyone but Walt, and even him not all of it. I don't know your name. I don't know your face. I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if it'll sit in that lamp room until the tower finally falls into the sea. But if you're reading it, you found the light. That means you're the kind of person who looks in the places other people walk past. That was always your mother's gift too. The account is yours. The land is yours, whatever's left of it by the time anybody bothers to read a dead keeper's paperwork. I'm sorry I wasn't there to give it to you myself. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but I want you to know, whoever you turned out to be, you were never forgotten. Not for one single year. The light goes dark before the harbour forgets who kept it safe. I meant that for you before I ever said it out loud to anyone else. Your grandfather, Silas Locke Dawson, read it a third time, a fourth. Somewhere around the fifth, his eyes had gone too blurred to keep reading. The stockroom smelled the same as it always did, sawdust and machine oil, and none of it seemed like the right smell for a moment this large. He just sat there, with the letter in his lap, and the bare bulb humming overhead. He let himself feel something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. He didn't cry easy. Crying in a group home got you noticed, and getting noticed rarely went the way you hoped. But he sat there a long while with his throat tight and his eyes stinging. Eventually he let a few tears fall onto the letter's brittle edge. He didn't wipe them away right off. For the first time in his whole life, somebody had written him a letter that started with sorry and ended with you were never forgotten. He opened the passbook next, hands steadier now. The entries ran small at first. $20, 40, 100. Some years, when the harbour had a good season. But they never stopped. Not once in nearly 40 years. Deposits sliding in every few months like a tide that never fully went out. Interest had compounded quiet in the background the whole time, the way money does when nobody's watching it and nobody's spending it. The final balance, entered in a teller's hand 3 years back, the year Silas died, read $114,620. Dawson had never in his life held more than $60 at once. He sat with that number a long time too, turning it over, not quite able to make it feel real. It didn't feel like money, it felt like proof. Proof that somewhere out there, decades before he was born, an old man with a bad conscience had made a decision. A grandson he'd never meet was worth 40 years of quiet, unglamorous work. He thought about every placement, every folder, every caseworker who told him gently that sometimes families just don't work out, kiddo, and it's nobody's fault. He thought about how many nights he told himself the same thing, that it wasn't anybody's fault, that some kids just didn't get families, that wanting one too hard was how you set yourself up to get hurt. He'd been wrong the whole time. Somebody had wanted him. Somebody had built something for him, brick by brick, dollar by dollar for nearly 4 decades. Without ever once getting to say his name out loud, he went to Walt first thing the next morning, before the bait shop even opened. He pounded on the door until Walt came down in an undershirt, squinting against the early light. "He wrote me a letter," Dawson said, and his voice cracked on the word letter in a way it hadn't cracked since he was maybe 11 years old. He knew about me. He was saving for me the whole time. Walt didn't say anything for a moment. He just opened the door wider and waved Dawson inside. Put coffee on. Sat across the little table in the back room while Dawson read him the letter. Out loud. Voice unsteady in places, steady in others. When Dawson finished, Walt sat quiet a long moment, looking at his own hands. "I knew he had a hard time after Marisol left," Walt said finally. "I didn't know it went this deep. Man never once mentioned a grandson to me. Not once, in 11 years serving under him. Not in another 20-some years after that, drinking with him at the same bar every Friday. Walt shook his head slow. That's Silas all over. Carried the heaviest things himself. Never once asked anybody to help him carry them. There's a number, Dawson said. In the passbook. $114,000. Walt's eyebrows went up just slightly. That's so. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to know today, Walt said. First thing you do is get that money and that letter and that ledger somewhere safe. Get a lawyer to look at all of it. Griff Talbot is not going to sit still once he figures out there's real money attached to that point. And he already offered you $15,000 for the land itself before he even knew about any of this. Dawson told him about the visit, the rising offers, the way Talbot's smile had cracked at the edges when Dawson turned him down. Walt's face went hard in a way Dawson hadn't seen on him before. Talbot's in deeper than $15,000, Walt said. Word is he's already pre-sold 2 lots off that point to money men down in Boston, banking a deposit against land he doesn't legally have title to yet. If that deal falls through, he's not just embarrassed, he's ruined. Walt stood, refilled his own coffee, didn't sit back down right away. A man that far underwater doesn't offer $15,000 and walk away quiet when you say no. He's going to come back harder. How much harder? However hard he has to. Dawson spent that whole day working his shift with his mind somewhere out on the point. The letter folded now inside his jacket pocket next to the ledger. Both of them pressed against his chest, like things that could still be taken from him if he wasn't careful. Talbot didn't come back to the hardware store. Instead, 3 days later, a certified letter arrived at Ansell's address, forwarded, addressed to Dawson Locke, from a law office in the county seat. Dawson opened it standing in the stockroom, Ansell reading over his shoulder because Dawson's hands had started shaking again, and Ansell could see it. The letter was a formal notice. Talbot's attorney was filing an emergency motion with the county to void the auction sale. He argued the lien satisfaction clause Dawson had used was intended for residential tax liens, not federal maritime easements. The sale to Dawson, he claimed, was improper and should be unwound in favour of a proper competitive auction. One at which, the letter noted, with a lawyer's careful neutrality, Mr. Talbot intended to bid. He's trying to take it back through the county, Ansell said, reading the last line twice. Can he do that? I don't know. That's a question for somebody who actually reads this kind of thing for a living. Ansell folded the letter carefully, handed it back. You need a lawyer, kid, a real one, a real. Not just Walt's good sense, though Walt's good sense isn't nothing. Dawson thought about the passbook balance sitting folded in oilcloth in his duffel bag. $114,000. Enough, maybe, to hire somebody who knew exactly how to read a letter like this one. He thought about Silas Locke's handwriting going big and messy at the edges whenever something mattered to him. About a grandson he'd never met, who was, apparently, exactly the kind of person who looked in the places other people walked past. I need a lawyer, Dawson said, mostly to himself. He folded the letter into the same pocket as everything else Silas Locke had left behind. He found one 2 days later. A woman named Priya Desai, who worked out of a storefront office above the pharmacy in the county seat. She took one look at the ledger, the letter, and the federal seal date on the lamproom notice. She told him, flatly, he had a much stronger claim than Talbot's lawyer wanted him to believe. This clause you used, Priya said, tapping the printout Dawson had carried folded in his pocket since the auction. It's obscure, but it's real. It's not limited to residential liens the way Talbot's attorney is claiming. More importantly, she pulled up something on her laptop, turned the screen toward him. I ran a title search on that parcel this morning, because Talbot's motion made me curious. There's an older document in the chain of title nobody's touched in 50 years. A federal land transfer grant recorded in 1974, naming Silas Locke as grantee, tied to his keeper's tenure before the tower was automated. It was never properly severed when the county took the property back into inventory for unpaid taxes after he died. Dawson sat very still. What does that mean? He said. It means, Priya said, the county might not have even had clear title to sell you in the first place. Your grandfather's original grant may never have legally expired, which means Talbot's 2 Boston buyers didn't just pre-buy land contingent on an auction he won. They pre-bought land that might have belonged to your family since before your mother was even born. 2 days after Priya took the case, before the hearing had even been scheduled, something happened. Dawson didn't tell anyone about it for almost a week. He'd gone back out to the point that evening, the way he still did most nights. Less out of necessity now, more out of a habit that felt too important to break. Some nights he brought nothing at all, just himself, just the quiet, and stood a while listening to the waterwork, at the rocks below the seawall. The fence was still there, sagging in its 2 gaps. The county's dead padlock still hung on the gate, though it no longer meant anything at all. He climbed through the familiar gap and sat on an overturned lobster crate near the base of the tower. There was an envelope wedged in the fence, tucked behind a slat where the wind wouldn't take it. Plain white, no name on the front. Inside was $200 in worn 20s and a note in handwriting that shook slightly. An older hand, unsteady but careful. Your grandfather towed my husband's boat off the ledge in a storm in 1979 and never once let us pay him back. Said the harbour takes care of its own. I don't know what you need right now, but I know what it's like to owe a lock and never get the chance to settle it. This isn't much. It's what I have. Buy yourself something warm. No name, no return address. Just the money and the note, folded twice, left where only someone who knew to check that fence would find it. Dawson sat with it a long time. The way he'd sat with the letter, the passbook, every piece of his grandfather's life that kept surfacing where he'd never thought to look. He didn't spend the money right away. He kept it folded inside his jacket next to everything else. It felt less like money and more like proof. Proof that Silas Locke's 40 years of quiet, unpaid kindness hadn't disappeared when the state took the light away from him. It had just gone underground, the way water does, and kept moving. He showed Walt the note the next morning at the bait shop. Walt read it twice. Something crossed his face that Dawson had started to recognise as grief. The particular grief of an old man watching a debt finally get paid, decades late, to somebody who'd earned it without ever knowing he had. "That'll be Ruth Callahan," Walt said. Or her daughter, more like, since Ruth passed a few winters back. Her husband Ray went down off the ledge in a nor'easter, 79. Engine dead, boat taking water. Silas took the launch out alone, conditions the Coast Guard itself wouldn't clear a rescue boat in. Towed Ray home by handline the last quarter mile, when the tow rope snapped. Ray tried to pay him for years. Silas never took a dime. Walt handed the note back careful, like it was something that might tear. Man had about 40 of those debts sitting out there, all through this harbour. People who never got to settle up. Guess word's getting around that now they finally can. Over the following days, word did get around, the particular way it does in a town small enough to fit in a single church supper. A retired lobsterman left a bag of frozen scallops on the hardware store counter with Dawson's name on it. A woman Dawson had never met stopped him outside the diner and pressed a folded $10 bill into his palm before he could refuse it. "Your grandfather fixed my father's outboard for free in '82, she said. "I've been meaning to pay that back for 43 years. An old fisherman named Gus Merrow had known Silas since they were boys, running the docks together. He started showing up most afternoons at the hardware store. He'd just sit on the loading dock and tell Dawson stories, one after another. Stories about a keeper who never once let anyone owe him anything he could forgive. Instead, it wasn't the money that mattered, though the money helped. It was the accumulation of it. 40 small proofs stacking one on top of the other. Proof that a stubborn, silent old man had spent his whole life quietly making sure nobody in his harbour ever had to ask him twice. Meanwhile, Talbot's motion moved forward on its own track, uglier by the week. Ferris filed an amended complaint. It questioned not just the auctions clause, but Dawson's competency to hold property at all, citing his age and his lack of a permanent address. Priya called it flatly, in her office one afternoon, the oldest trick in this particular book. One that usually only works on people who don't have a lawyer telling them exactly what it is. "Can he actually do that?" Dawson asked. "Question whether I'm allowed to own anything." "He can file it," Priya said. "Filing cost him nothing but Talbot's money. Whether it holds up is different, and it doesn't. Not for an emancipated 18-year-old with a documented income, and a permanent lease arrangement, which is exactly what your stockroom situation with Ansel amounts to on paper, if we file it right." She was already typing as she spoke, drafting the response that would close that door before the hearing even opened it. "This is a pressure tactic," He's hoping you'll get scared and take a payout before the commission ever sees the title question. Don't get scared. Dawson thought about that instruction a long time afterward, turning it over the way he turned over everything that mattered. He'd spent his whole life being the kind of kid adults could scare into compliance. Compliance was how you survived a system that moved you 6 times before you turned 18 and never once asked what you wanted. Getting scared and doing what you were told was practically a survival skill. But he had a letter now that said you were never forgotten. A ledger that proved a man had spent 4 decades keeping promises nobody made him keep. Somewhere in the accumulation of all of it, Dawson found he genuinely wasn't scared of Griff Talbot anymore. Talbot was a man who'd bet $86,000 he didn't have on land he didn't own. Dawson Locke, whatever else he was, had learned to check every seam in a wall before he trusted it, and he'd checked this one from every side there was. A week before the hearing, Talbot tried one more approach. He caught Dawson alone at the point. The two of them stood at the sagging fence in the late afternoon light. Talbot's silver truck idled on the breakwater road behind him. 30,000, Talbot said. No preamble. That's my absolute final number. More money than that tower will ever be worth to you, honestly. Condemned as it is. You said 15 was final 2 weeks ago. Circumstances changed. They did, Dawson agreed. I found out my grandfather built this whole harbour's worth of quiet kindness for 40 years. I found out he was saving for a grandson he never met. I found out the county might not have even had clear title to sell in the first place. Circumstances changed a lot, Mr. Talbot. Mostly for you. Talbot's jaw worked once, the same way it had at the diner. For the first time, Dawson saw something underneath the salesman's polish that looked almost like fear. You don't understand what happens to me if this hearing goes against me, Talbot said. Quieter now. I've got $86,000 of other people's money sitting in an account I already spent half of. If that deal collapses, I don't just lose a project. I lose my license, probably. Maybe my house. You're a kid who found a lucky letter in a wall. I've built a whole life on this county, trusting my paperwork. My grandfather built a whole harbour trusting his word, Dawson said, and he never once needed a lawyer to make people believe him. He looked at Talbot a long moment. I'm not trying to ruin you, Mr. Talbot, but I'm not giving this up either. Whatever happens to you happens because of choices you made before you ever met me. Talbot didn't answer that. He got back in his truck and drove off too fast for the gravel again. Dawson stood at the fence a long while afterward, watching the tower catch the last of the light, thinking about a grandfather who'd apparently spent his whole life being exactly this calm in the face of exactly this kind of pressure, finding, for the first time, that some things really did run in the family. A week into the fight with Talbot's lawyer, Walt suggested something Dawson hadn't considered, that they walk the whole point together, slow, the way Silas used to walk it every morning before his shift. Not for evidence, just to see it the way the old man had seen it, one last time, before a room full of strangers decided what to do with it. They went out early on a Saturday, the fog still sitting low on the water. Walt moved carefully on the bad knee, refusing Dawson's offer of an arm to lean on. He'd start at the fog bell, Walt said. He led Dawson to a squat iron bell on a concrete pier, a stone's throw from the tower. Green with verdigris, silent for decades. Check the clapper first, make sure salt hadn't seized it. Then he'd walk the seawall, looking for erosion. Then the tower base, checking the mortar joints. Then up the stairs, checking the lens, the gears. Walt ran a hand along the bell's cold iron surface. Something tender in the gesture. Same route every morning, 30-some years. Rain or shine, storm or calm. I used to think it was just duty. It took me a long while to understand it was closer to love than duty. Some men only know how to love a thing, by tending it careful, over and over, whether anyone's watching or not. Dawson touched the bell's surface too, feeling the cold of it seep into his palm. Why'd it go quiet? Automation replaced it with an electric horn in the 70s, Walt said. Silas fought that decision harder than he ever fought anything else in his life. Wrote letters to 3 separate congressmen. Said a bell had a voice a machine could never replicate. Said sailors in fog trusted a human hand more than a recording. Walt patted the bell once like a man greeting an old friend. He lost that fight, same as he lost the fight to keep his job when they automated the light itself 7 years later. But he never stopped coming out to check the clapper anyway, long after it stopped being his job to check anything at all. Some habits outlive the reason you started them. They work their way around the seawall. Walt narrated each spot the way a man narrates a memory he's walked through 1,000 times. They reached a low stretch of stonework near the tower's landward side. Walt stopped and frowned, running his palm along a seam in the mortar. To Dawson's eye, it looked no different from any other seam along the wall. "This is new," Walt said slowly. "Or newish. Silas repointed this whole stretch himself sometime in the early 90s. I remember him doing it. Took him the better part of a summer working evenings after his harbour jobs. I always figured he was just keeping the wall sound." He pressed harder, and a section maybe 2 feet across gave slightly under his palm. The mortar, clearly newer, clearly patched with more care than simple maintenance required. This isn't just repair work. This is a man hiding something behind a wall. He built himself to hide it. Dawson found a length of rebar half buried in the gravel. He worked it into the seam, prying carefully, the way he'd pried the grate loose weeks earlier. The patched section came away easier than 4 decades of weathering should have allowed. Behind it was a shallow cavity, lined with the same tar paper as the grate at the tower's base. Inside, wrapped again in oilcloth, was a small wooden box. Hand-built dovetailed corners cut with obvious care by somebody who took pride in joinery, even when nobody would ever see the joints. Dawson opened it there on the seawall. His hands were steady now, in a way they hadn't been weeks earlier when he'd first opened the strongbox in the lamp room. Inside was a stack of photographs older than the ones Gus had brought over, a woman's handwriting on the back of several, and a small gold locket, tarnished, the clasp stiff with age. "That's Marisol's hand," Walt said quietly, looking at the photograph captions. "I'd know it. She used to write out the supply list for the harbour store when she was young, before she left. Same slant to the letters." He touched the locket gently. "I never saw this before. Silas must have kept whatever she left behind, whatever she couldn't take with her. He built her a hiding place, same as he built one for you." Dawson opened the locket carefully, the hinge stiff with rust. Inside, on one side, was a tiny photograph of a young woman with dark hair and an uncertain smile, standing on the same breakwater road, the tower visible behind her. On the other side, unmistakably, was a photograph of an infant, swaddled, held awkwardly by the same woman. A hospital wristband was visible in the frame, the earliest days of a life that would eventually lead to a stockroom cot and a dollar bid at a county auction. "That's me," Dawson said, voice barely above a whisper. "That has to be me." "That's you," Walt agreed, just as quiet. Dawson sat down hard on the seawall, the locket cradled in both hands. For a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The fog still sat low over the water. The fog bell stood silent beside them, the way it had been silent for 50 years. Waiting, apparently, the same way everything else. Out on that point had been waiting for somebody to finally come looking. "She kept a photograph of me," Dawson said eventually. "She didn't just leave and forget. She kept this and he kept it after her. Which means somewhere along the way she must have come back, at least once. At least long enough to leave this with him." Walt considered that carefully. Or she mailed it to him. Or he tracked down word of you through a cousin, a nurse, somebody who'd talk. "I don't know the whole shape of it, Dawson, and I'm not sure anybody left alive does. But I know a man doesn't build a hidden compartment in a seawall to protect a locket he found by accident. He built this the same careful way he built the one behind the tower's base. Both of them for the same reason. Both of them waiting on the same person." They brought the wooden box back to Priya's office that afternoon. She added the photographs and the locket to the growing stack of evidence for the Harbour Commission. But she noted gently that some of what they'd found mattered more to Dawson's own life than to the legal argument itself. "The county doesn't need to see the locket to rule on the title," she said. "But I imagine you needed to find it a great deal more than the county needs to see it." Dawson kept the locket in his jacket pocket after that, alongside the roll of electrical tape, alongside everything else that had piled up there over 3 strange, unravelling weeks. Some nights, lying on the cot in the stockroom, he'd take it out and open it, just to look at the 2 photographs side by side. A scared young woman and the infant she hadn't been able to keep. Both of them, somehow, still connected across 30 years to a boy who'd once believed nobody in the world had ever wanted him at all. 3 days before the hearing, Ivy's Diner hosted what passed in Cormorant Point for a town meeting, an informal gathering the Harbour Commission scheduled to let residents ask questions before Friday's formal vote. Dawson found himself sitting 2 tables away from Griff Talbot, for the better part of an hour, each of them pretending not to notice the other. Odette Hargrove stood at the counter and answered questions as they came. Mostly procedural, mostly from residents worried about what a contested title might mean for property values along the rest of the Breakwater Road. Talbot answered a few himself, still composed in front of a room, still capable of the smooth, reasonable voice that had probably closed 100 deals before this one went sideways on him. "I want to be clear," Talbot said, addressing the room more than Dawson directly, "that my position has never been about denying anyone their rightful inheritance. It's about making sure this county's auction process is sound for everyone who relies on it." Dawson said nothing. He'd learned it from a letter and a ledger both. The loudest voice in a room wasn't always the one telling the truest version of things. An older woman near the counter, someone Dawson didn't recognise, raised her hand. "Didn't you already have buyers lined up for that point before the auction even happened, Griff? My nephew does closings up in Bangor. Said your paperwork was already moving before the gavel came down." A ripple of quiet went through the room. Talbot's composure held barely, a practiced smile smoothing over whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes. "Standard due diligence," Talbot said. "Any responsible developer lines up financing in advance of an acquisition." "Financing's different from selling lots you don't own yet," the woman said, not unkindly. "Just plain, the way people in small towns tend to say true things." Talbot didn't answer that directly. He glanced just once toward Dawson's table. Dawson met his eyes without flinching, the way he'd learned to meet a caseworker's eyes when they delivered news he didn't want. Walt, sitting beside Dawson, leaned in slightly, voice pitched only for the two of them. "He already knows how Friday goes," Walt murmured. "Man's just performing composure for a room that stopped believing him about 10 minutes ago." After the meeting broke up, Dawson found himself briefly alone near the diner's door, reaching for his jacket. A young woman he didn't recognise approached, hesitant, holding a coffee cup she clearly hadn't finished. "You're Dawson Locke," she said. "I'm Claire, I work in Mr. Talbot's office. I probably shouldn't be talking to you." Dawson said nothing, waiting. He'd learned adults sometimes needed silence before they said the thing they'd actually come to say. He knew, Claire said quietly, about the federal grant. Or at least he knew there was something unusual in the title history before the auction ever happened. His paralegal flagged an anomaly in the county records back in the spring. Some old federal document that hadn't been properly cleared. Mr. Talbot told her not to pursue it. Said it was probably nothing. Said the county's tax sale process would clear the title regardless. She glanced back toward the diner, checking that no one had followed her out. "I just thought you should know he wasn't blindsided by any of this on Friday. He gambled that nobody would ever look as closely as your lawyer did." She left before Dawson could properly thank her, disappearing into the dark toward a car parked down the block. He told Priya about Claire's visit the next morning. She made careful notes, said it wouldn't change the hearing's outcome much, since the title question would resolve on the documents regardless of Talbot's state of mind. But it might matter later if the Boston Fund's lawyers ever needed to prove Talbot knew the risk going in. "It won't help him," Priya said simply. "But it's useful to know exactly what kind of gamble he made, going in." That evening, walking back to the hardware store, Dawson passed Ivy's diner and saw, through the window, Talbot sitting alone at the counter, coffee untouched in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. The practiced smile nowhere in evidence, now that there was no room left to perform it for. Dawson didn't stop. He didn't feel triumphant looking at Talbot's slumped shoulders through that window, the way he might have expected to feel a month earlier. He mostly felt tired, a little sad in a way he couldn't fully explain. The sadness of watching somebody's whole careful confidence come apart in real time. Even when that somebody had built it on a foundation he probably always knew was cracked. He thought about his grandfather's letter, about a man who'd carried his own regret in silence for 40 years, rather than let it curdle into something that hurt anybody else. He understood, walking home in the cold that night, exactly which kind of man he wanted to grow into. The midpoint turn came 4 days before the hearing. It came from a place Dawson never expected. Priya called him into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. Her usual composed manner had slipped into something closer to urgency. She spread 3 documents across her desk. "I want to walk you through something before we file our final response," she said. "When I ran the deeper title search, I found something in the county's probate file from 3 years ago when Silas Locke's estate was processed after his death. It's a second will." Dawson sat forward. He had a will. He had two, Priya said. The first, filed and recognised by probate, left nothing to anyone by name. The county had no record of any living relative. The estate reverted to the state after taxes went unpaid on the tower for 5 years. That's exactly how it ended up at auction. She turned the page toward him. But this second document is unfiled. I found it folded inside a probate box nobody had reason to reopen until I specifically requested it this week. It names an intended beneficiary, directly. She read it aloud. To my grandson, if he is ever found, whatever remains of what I built. If he is never found, let the harbour keep it, the way the harbour kept me. Dawson read the line twice, the same way he'd read the letter in the strongbox, the same way he'd read the ledger's last entry. Why wasn't this filed? Dawson asked. Because your grandfather never had a legal way to name you, Priya said gently. He didn't know your name, didn't know if you existed at all, didn't know if Marisol had even kept the baby. A probate court can't act on a bequest to an unnamed, unlocated person. So this document sat unfiled. There was no one alive who could complete it, until you walked into a county auction and bid $1 on a condemned lighthouse. She let that settle a moment. This isn't just corroboration for the hearing, Dawson. This is your grandfather trying, one more time, from beyond everything, to make sure whatever he built found its way to you. He never stopped trying. Even the paperwork he couldn't finish was still reaching for you. Dawson sat with that for a long moment. The office was quiet around them, traffic passing faint on the street below. I need to tell you something else, Priya said. It changes the shape of Friday's hearing, and I don't want you walking in surprised. She pulled a fourth page from the folder. I contacted the 2 Boston buyers named in Talbot's pre-sale contracts as part of due diligence. They're not obscure investors. They're a small development fund already facing scrutiny in 2 other counties for exactly this kind of contingent deposit arrangement on land without clear title. One of their partners confirmed off the record that if this parcel's title comes back contested Friday, they intend to pursue Talbot personally for the return of their $86,000, plus damages, regardless of what the commission decides about your ownership. So even if I lose, Dawson said slowly, he still loses. Talbot built his entire position on a bet, Priya said, that the auction would go through clean and fast. No heir, no grant, no grandson showing up to complicate things. Every version of Friday that surfaces the truth cost him. The only version where he comes out whole is the one where nobody ever finds any of this. She looked at him, and you already found all of it. That evening, Dawson walked out to the point one more time before the hearing. The unfiled will now added to the small stack of documents that had rewritten his entire life in the span of 3 weeks. See how do you know? He sat on the same overturned lobster crate where he'd found Ruth Callahan's envelope. He thought about a stubborn, silent man who tried, over and over, every way available to him, to make sure a boy he'd never met would someday know he'd been loved. A letter in a strongbox, a passbook growing quiet for 40 years, a will he couldn't legally file because he didn't have a name to put on it. Every door Silas Locke could find, he'd tried. Every door had stayed shut until the exact right person happened to raise his hand at an auction for $1. Walt found him there at dusk, walking out with 2 mugs of coffee from the bait shop. He sat beside Dawson on a second crate without being asked. You ready for Friday? Walt said. I don't know what ready feels like, Dawson admitted. I've never had anything worth being ready to defend before. Walt was quiet a moment, looking out at the tower, catching the last orange light of the day. Silas used to say the hardest part of keeping alight isn't the storms, Walt said. Storms you can see coming. It's the ordinary nights, when nothing's wrong, when it would be easy to let the flame go low because nobody's watching close enough to notice. He said the whole job was just refusing to let it go, low, storm or no storm, watched or not. Walt looked over at Dawson. You've been doing that same job 3 weeks now, kid, whether you noticed it or not, keeping something lit that everybody else already wrote off as dark. Dawson didn't say anything for a while. He just sat with the coffee going warm in his hands, the tower standing dark and patient against the sky, the way it had stood for 130 years, the way it would keep standing regardless of what any hearing decided on Friday. He never got to see me, Dawson said finally. Never got to know if I turned out all right. No, Walt agreed, but he trusted you would. 40 years of trusting a kid he never met would turn out right. Exactly the kind of person who checks a locked door twice just in case. Man had good instincts that way, right to the end. They sat until the light went fully out over the water, 2 mugs going cold between them. Dawson thought, for the first time in his whole life, that maybe wanting something didn't always have to end in getting hurt. Thursday, the day before the hearing, brought one more surprise. It came from the harbour itself. Gus Merrow found Dawson on the hardware store's loading dock during his afternoon break. He set down a cardboard box, without a word of preamble. "Found this cleaning out my late brother's shed," Gus said. "He kept everything, my brother did. Never threw out so much as a receipt in 60 years. This was in with his old harbour paperwork. Inside the box was a stack of photographs curling at the edges, the kind taken on a cheap camera decades ago and never properly stored." Dawson sorted through them slow. A younger Walt, dark-haired, standing on the lamproom gallery beside a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and pale eyes. Eyes that looked unmistakably like the eyes Dawson saw in his own mirror every morning. "That's him," Gus said, tapping the photo. "Silas Locke, 19 and 70-something. Up on that gallery he practically lived on." He pulled another photo free. "And that's you, or close enough to make an old man's heart skip. Same jaw. Same way of standing like you're bracing for weather that hasn't come yet." Dawson held the photograph a long time. The first image he'd ever seen of his grandfather's actual face. The man behind the handwriting, behind the ledger, behind the letter that had cracked something open in his chest he hadn't known was sealed. "Can I keep these?" Dawson asked, voice rough. "They're yours," Gus said. "Everything of Silas's was always going to end up yours eventually. Just took the harbour a while to figure out how to get it to you." Dawson brought the photographs to Walt that evening. The old man went quiet a long while looking through them. He landed finally on one taken at what looked like a 4th of July gathering on the pier. Silas standing slightly apart from a knot of other keepers and fishermen, watching the water instead of the camera, the way a man watches something he's responsible for, even when he's supposed to be relaxing. "That's exactly him," Walt said softly. "Never once let himself fully off duty, not even at a picnic." He handed the stack back careful. "You've got his whole face, kid. I should have seen it the first evening you stood at that fence. Guess I wasn't looking for it yet." That night back in the stockroom, Dawson arranged everything Silas Locke had left behind across the floor in a careful row, the way he imagined a keeper might have laid out his tools before a long watch. The ledger, the letter, the passbook, the unfiled will Priya had found, the photographs Gus had carried over in a cardboard box, Ruth Callahan's folded 20s, and the note that had started it all. 9 months ago, he'd owned a duffel bag and a coffee can of quarters. Tonight he had a grandfather's whole life laid out in front of him. 40 years of quiet, stubborn love finally surfacing all at once, like something long held underwater, finally breaking the surface for air. He thought about the hearing tomorrow, about Talbot's cracked smile, about $86,000 riding on a bet that nobody would ever come looking in the places other people walked past. He fell asleep that night without the ledger under his pillow, for the first time in 3 weeks. He didn't need it there anymore to believe what it said. He'd read it enough times now that the words had moved somewhere permanent, somewhere the strongbox couldn't hold and the hearing couldn't take away, no matter which way the commission's vote fell in the morning. 2 nights before the hearing, Dawson still couldn't sleep. He walked the breakwater road again, well past midnight. The cold bit at his ears. The tower stood a black shape against a blacker sky. He wasn't the only one awake out there. A pickup sat parked on the shoulder near the fence. Engine off. A shape behind the wheel. Dawson's stomach tightened. He thought, for one bad second, that it might be Talbot. Or somebody Talbot had sent. It was Odette Hargrove. She rolled the window down when she saw him approach, her breath fogging in the cold. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No, ma'am, I'm not supposed to talk to you about the motion before the hearing," Odette said. "Ex parte rules, and I take them seriously. But I drove out here because I wanted to see the place myself. In the dark, before I have to sit in judgment on it tomorrow." She looked past him, toward the black tower. "My grandfather fished this harbour his whole life. Told me once that Silas Locke towed him home in a squall when I was still small enough to not remember it firsthand. I only know it because my grandfather told the story so many times it became mine too." Dawson didn't know what to say to that. He stood there in the cold, hands in his pockets, the roll of tape a small hard shape against his palm. "I'm not telling you how the vote's going to go," Odette said. "Wouldn't be right, and I mean that. But I want you to know something regardless of how it lands. Whatever this county decides on paper, this harbour already knows whose grandson you are. Has known it, probably, since the day you climbed a fence you'd never seen before, like you already owned it." She rolled the window back up part way. Paused. "Get some sleep, Mr. Locke. Long day tomorrow." She pulled away slow, taillights shrinking down the breakwater road. Dawson stood there a while longer before he turned back toward town. Something in his chest had loosened, just slightly, though the conversation hadn't promised him anything at all. He told Walt about it the next morning, over coffee at the bait shop, and Walt just nodded slow, unsurprised. "Odette's people have fished this harbour 4 generations, Walt said. "She wouldn't say a word out of turn if you paid her, and she never has, not once, all the years I've known her. But she wouldn't have driven out to that point in the middle of the night for just anybody either." He topped off both their mugs. "Some people show you where they stand without ever having to say it plain. Guess that's another thing that runs thicker in this harbour than most places." Dawson carried that conversation into the hearing the next day, the same way he carried the ledger, the letter, the locket. Not as proof of anything. Just one more small stone on a pile he was only beginning to understand. Built his whole life, one stranger's quiet kindness at a time. The Harbour Commission met in the same county building where the auction had happened. Same folding chairs, same groaning radiator. But this time the room was fuller. Word had gotten around, the way word does in a town small enough that everyone's cousin knows everyone else's business. By the time Dawson walked in with Priya at 9 in the morning, most of the chairs were already taken. Griff Talbot sat at the front with his lawyer, a sharp younger man named Ferris, who kept a leather folder open on his lap, flipping through tabs with the practiced ease of someone who bills by the hour. Talbot himself looked thinner than he had at the diner, the canvas jacket replaced by an actual suit, the kind a man wears when he's decided the situation calls for armour. Walt sat 2 rows back, in a collared shirt Dawson had never seen him wear, hands folded on his knee, watching the front of the room with the same steady patience he'd probably once used holding a spotlight steady in gale wind. The commission chair was a woman named Odette Hargrove, who ran the county's coastal properties office. She called the room to order and read the motion into the record. Talbot's attorney stood first. This commission auctioned a federally easemented maritime structure using a residential tax lien clause never intended for such property, Ferris said, voice smooth, rehearsed. "My client entered good faith contracts contingent on acquiring clear title to this parcel. The sale to Mr. Locke should be voided and the property returned to proper competitive auction." Odette Hargrove looked to Priya, counsel for Mr. Locke. Priya stood unhurried, the leather folder tucked under one arm. "Before we discuss whether the clause my client used was properly applied," Priya said, "the commission should know something. It changes the entire premise of this hearing. This parcel was never solely the county's to auction in the first place." Ferris looked up sharply. Talbot's face went still. "In 1974, Priya continued, the federal government executed a land transfer grant to the acting keeper of the Cormorant Point Light Station. In recognition of continued unofficial maintenance of the station and surrounding grounds following automation. That keeper was Silas Locke." She opened the folder, produced a certified copy, handed it to the clerk to enter into the record. "This grant was never formally severed when the county took the parcel into tax inventory following Mr. Locke's death 3 years ago. Which means the county's claim to full clear title, the very claim Mr. Talbot's own pre-sale contracts depend on, has been in question since before this auction ever took place." A murmur moved through the room. Odette Hargrove took the document and read it slowly, her eyebrows lifting. "This is dated and sealed," she said. "This looks legitimate." "It's a matter of federal record," Priya said. "My office confirmed it directly with the Regional Maritime Property Office 2 days ago." Ferris was on his feet. "This is the first my client is hearing of any such grant. If true, it would seem to support voiding the sale entirely, since the county had no clear right to auction the parcel at all. It supports something," Priya said, calm, unhurried but not voiding the sale to my client. "Because Silas Locke had one living direct descendant at the time of his death, his grandson." She turned, looked at Dawson, and something in the room seemed to shift, the way a held breath shifts when it's finally released. "Dawson Locke." The murmur became something louder. Talbot's face had gone the colour of old paper. "That's absurd," Ferris said, though his voice had lost some of its polish. "There's no documentation connecting this young man to Silas Locke beyond a shared surname." "There is," Priya said, "and I'd like to call a witness who can speak to it directly. Walt Pruden served under Silas Locke as an assistant keeper for 11 years and maintained a close friendship with him for decades after. Mr. Pruden, would you come forward?" Walt rose slow, favouring the bad knee, and walked to the small table set at the front of the room. The same table where the auctioneer's gavel had come down weeks earlier. "Mr. Pruden," Priya said, "can you identify this ledger?" She handed him the cloth-bound book. Walt opened it, ran his thumb along the first page, the way a man touches something he's certain of. "This is Silas Locke's service ledger," Walt said, voice steady, carrying to the back of the room. "I'd know his hand anywhere. I served under this man 11 years. This is his writing, his dates, his log of the 76 rescue. I was present for myself, standing not 20 feet from him on that ledge." "And this letter," Priya said, producing the yellowed envelope. "Addressed, 'In your assessment.' In whose hand?" Walt read the address on the front out loud, slow, letting every word land. "For Marisol's boy. When he's old enough. When he's ready." He looked up, and his voice for the first time wavered. "That's Silas's hand. Marisol was his daughter. I knew her as a girl, before she left this town scared and pregnant and never came back. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that she'd ever had a son. But I know this letter is Silas Locke, reaching for a grandson he never got to meet. And I know that boy is sitting right there." He pointed, and every head in the room turned to look at Dawson, who sat very still, the way he'd learned to sit still in 100 rooms where adults decided things about his life without asking him first. Except this time, for the first time he could remember, the room was deciding something in his favour. Odette Hargrove let the silence sit a moment before she spoke. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "your pre-sale contracts were contingent on your winning clear title to this parcel at auction. Based on the documentation before this commission, the parcel's chain of title runs through Silas Locke's 1974 federal grant, unbroken to his sole surviving descendant, regardless of how the county's own tax sale auction was conducted." Ferris tried once more, voice thinner now. "We would ask for time to review this documentation independently before any ruling." "You'll have it," Odette said, "but I want to be plain about where this commission stands today. On the record, this body auctioned a parcel it believed it held clear title to. If that belief was mistaken, the remedy is not to strip a documented heir of his grandfather's land in favour of a developer's speculative buyers. The remedy is to recognise the title where the paper actually leads." She looked at Talbot directly. "Mr. Talbot, I'd strongly suggest you speak with your own attorney about the contracts you signed with your Boston buyers. Because based on what's in front of me today, I don't see how this commission votes to disturb Mr. Locke's claim." Talbot didn't say anything. He sat very still, staring at the certified copy of the 1974 grant sitting on the table. The same document that had just turned $86,000 of somebody else's money into a liability he'd have to answer for. Dawson didn't smile. He'd learned a long time ago that smiling too early was how you got hurt. Some habits, apparently, took longer than a hearing to unlearn. But he felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight there since the day the state handed him a check for $400 and called it done. The commission voted 11 minutes later, unanimous, to uphold the sale and formally recognise Dawson Locke's chain of title through his grandfather's federal grant. Odette Hargrove banged a small gavel of her own, quieter than Purdy's had been at the auction. It felt somehow like it settled something the first gavel never had. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters from the county paper wanted a quote. Dawson gave them one sentence. He kept the lights safe for 40 years. I just found out about it a little late. Talbot's lawyer was already on the phone with someone. Voice low and urgent, walking fast toward the parking lot. Talbot himself lingered a moment near the steps, watching Dawson and Walt and Priya standing together in the cold morning light. For once his face didn't have a salesman's smile stitched onto it at all. The county recorded the commission's ruling within a week. With it came the plain, procedural unwinding of everything Griff Talbot had built his position on. The Boston Development Fund confirmed the title dispute had resolved against Talbot's contingency clause. Their own attorneys filed for return of their $86,000 deposit within days. Talbot didn't have it. He'd already spent most of it on a boat, bought to celebrate a deal that had never actually closed. And a retainer paid to Ferris, who turned out unwilling to discount it now that the case had gone sideways. Word moved through Cormorant Point the way it always did, fast and thorough. Within a month, Talbot had quietly listed his own waterfront office for sale. He stopped showing up at the diner counter where he used to hold court most mornings. Dawson heard, second-hand from Gus Merrow, that Talbot had taken a project 2 counties north, smaller, humbler than anything he'd have touched a year earlier. The kind of work a man takes when his name doesn't open doors the way it used to. Dawson didn't celebrate any of it. He'd learned from a ledger and a letter that the man who raised him, in every way that counted, spent 40 years building instead of gloating. Gloating, Dawson decided, wasn't a Locke family habit worth starting now. He used the passbook money carefully, the way Priya advised, set most of it aside, drew only what he needed to begin the restoration Silas Locke had apparently been dreaming about the whole time he filled that account. The tower needed real work. A structural engineer out of Bangor confirmed the stonework was sound, solid enough to outlast another century if the roof and the ironwork got proper attention. Over the following months, Dawson hired local when he could, a roofer who'd known Silas from the harbour, an electrician who'd towed a boat once and never forgotten it, a mason who did the pointing work at cost. Standing at the base of the tower with his trowel in hand, he said it plainly. Some debts you pay, because the harbour remembers what the county forgets. Priya filed the completed paperwork Silas's original grant made possible. The Federal Maritime Registry approved Cormorant Point Light as a registered private aid to navigation, a designation that let Dawson relight the lamp legally under Coast Guard oversight for the first time since 1984. The relighting happened on a clear evening in early autumn, 6 months after the auction. Most of the harbour gathered on the breakwater road to watch. Walt stood beside Dawson on the gallery deck, the same deck where a younger Walt once stood, in a photograph, beside a broad-shouldered man with pale eyes. Priya came. Ansel closed the hardware store early to be there. Gus Merrow brought a folding chair, set it up right at the fence line, like he intended to stay all night if the ceremony called for it. Ruth Callahan's daughter came too, though Dawson hadn't invited her by name. He'd only mentioned the date to Walt and let word travel the way it always did. She stood near the back. Dawson found her afterward and tried to thank her properly for the envelope she'd left in the fence. She waved off his thanks the same way her mother's note had. "The harbour takes care of its own," she said. "Your grandfather taught this whole town that, whether he meant to or not." At dusk, Dawson climbed the tower's interior stairs, worn smooth by 130 years of keepers before him. He stood in the lamp room where his grandfather had sealed a false panel 40 years earlier. The lens housing had been cleaned and refitted with a modern LED unit, small enough to disappear into the original brass fittings. The old glass drum stood around it now, a kind of monument. He switched it on at exactly 8 o'clock. The beam swept out across the darkening water, slow and steady, the same rhythm it had swept for 100 years. Before the Coast Guard decided, a light like this one didn't need a man standing watch inside it. Down on the breakwater road, the gathered crowd made a sound that wasn't quite cheering. Something quieter and more permanent than that. The sound a town makes when something it thought was gone for good comes back to it whole. Griff Talbot did not attend the relighting. But 3 weeks later, a cheque arrived at Priya's office. Unsigned, no note. Drawn on an account Talbot still controlled. Made out to the Cormorant Point Harbour Preservation Fund, the one Dawson had set up, with a small portion of the restoration budget. It wasn't a large amount, it was, Priya noted dryly, roughly what a man sets aside when he wants to settle a debt quietly, without ever admitting out loud that he owed one. Dawson didn't call to thank him. He didn't need to. He understood it better than most 18-year-olds could. Some people paid what they owed in silence because silence was the only language they trusted with something that mattered. He'd inherited that habit himself. He recognised it when he saw it. He kept the fund modest but real, seeded first with a portion of his own restoration budget. Later, with a share of the small entrance fee the town began charging, Once the Harbour Commission approved limited weekend access to the tower. The fund existed for one purpose: to help kids aging out of the foster system the way Dawson had. Kids with a duffel bag and a coffee can of quarters and nowhere particular to be. Kids who might need $40 a week and a stockroom to sleep in while they figured out what came next. Ansel became the fund's first trustee, unsurprised since he'd been quietly doing something similar himself for years without ever calling it a fund. The first recipient was a 17-year-old named Cole. He showed up in Cormorant Point that winter with almost nothing, having aged out of a placement 2 counties over. He took one look at the tower rising at the end of the Breakwater Road, asked Dawson, half joking, whether lighthouses came up for auction very often around here. Not often, Dawson told him, but they show up when you need them to. You just have to be the kind of person who checks the places everybody else walks past. He gave Cole a job sweeping floors at the hardware store, same as Ansel had once given him to Dawson. He didn't say much more about it. Some lessons, Dawson had learned, were better handed down the way Silas Locke had handed his down. Quietly, through action, trusted to land eventually, even if nobody was there to explain them out loud. Ansel had his own reasons for the rule he lived by. He told Dawson about them only once. The week after the certified letter arrived from Talbot's lawyer, they were closing up the store together, flipping the sign, counting the draw. Ansel said it without any particular build-up, the way older men sometimes let a hard thing out sideways instead of head-on. I aged out in Millinocket, Ansel said. 1981. State handed me $80 and a bus ticket and called it a childhood. Same as they did you. He locked the register drawer, set the key on its hook. Nobody looked out for me the way Walt's looking out for you now. Took me 12 years and 2 bad marriages to learn how to trust somebody who wasn't asking for anything back. How'd you learn it? Dawson asked. Slow, Ansel said. One decent person at a time. Man who taught me carpentry never once raised his voice at me, even when I earned it. Woman at the diner who kept a plate warm on nights I didn't have the 50 cents for coffee. You start adding those people up, one at a time. Eventually you've got enough of them stacked together that you can stand on the pile. He looked at Dawson steady. That's what you're building right now, whether you know it or not. Walt, that lawyer. Me, some fisherman leaving you frozen scallops. You're not just fighting Talbot for a lighthouse kid. You're finding out you were never as alone as the paperwork said you were. Dawson thought about that a long time after he'd walked back to the stockroom that night. He thought about it again 3 days later, when he opened the strongbox and found his grandfather's letter. He thought about it a third time, weeks after that, standing at the hearing, watching a room full of strangers decide, for once, in his favour. He never told Ansel how much that conversation had mattered. Some things, he was learning, you didn't say out loud, you just carried them forward. The way you'd carry a roll of tape. Quiet, useful, ready whenever the next thing needed fixing. Ansel came to the relighting too, closed the store early, stood near the back the way he always did, at anything that wasn't strictly his business to stand in front of. When the light swept on that first time, Dawson caught his eye across the crowd. Ansel gave him one short nod, the kind that meant more than a longer sentence would have. The following spring, once the restoration budget had covered the roof, the ironwork, the mason's careful pointing, Dawson used a portion of what remained to do one more thing. Nobody had asked him to do it. He hired a contractor to convert the old fog signal building beside the bell. The squat concrete structure became 2 small rooms, bunks, a shared bath. Simple, warm, nothing fancy. A place a kid with a duffel bag and nowhere to be could stay for free while the Harbour Fund helped them find steadier footing. He named it, on the modest sign Gus helped him letter by hand, the keeper's house. Cole was the first to live there, moved out of the stockroom cot Ansel had let him use, into a room of his own for the first time since he'd aged out. He hung a single photograph on his wall, one Dawson had given him from Gus's cardboard box, a duplicate print of the harbour from decades back, boats at the dock, the light burning steady behind them. Why give me this one? Cole asked, the day he pinned it up. Because somebody gave it to me first, Dawson said. Seemed like the kind of thing that's supposed to keep moving. By the second winter, 2 more kids had come through the keeper's house. One from a placement in Bangor, one who'd simply shown up on the Breakwater Road. He'd heard, through whatever channel word travels through kids in the system, that there was a lighthouse in Cormorant Point where a person could land soft for a while. Dawson never turned anyone away, who genuinely needed the room. He never asked for anything back beyond what Ansel had once asked of him. Show up, work honest, keep the place decent. Pass the same kindness on whenever your own turn came to give it. Walt took to calling the whole operation, half joking, Silas's second harbour. The name stuck around town before long, the particular way names do in a place small enough to agree on things without ever quite deciding to. Priya kept a small file on her desk after the case closed, one she never billed anyone for. She called it, when Dawson asked, the paperwork Silas couldn't finish. A copy of the unfiled will, a copy of the 1974 grant, a note in her own hand about a foster kid who taught her something about persistence that 4 years of law school never had. Most of my clients want to win, she told Dawson once. The two of them were going over the last of the county filings on a slow afternoon. You wanted to prove something existed. There's a difference. Winning's about beating somebody. Proving is about giving the truth a chance to stand up in a room, whether or not anybody planned on believing it. She closed the file, set it on the shelf beside the others. I don't get many cases like that. I'll remember this one longer than most. She kept representing the Harbour Fund after that. Pro bono. Whenever a new kid needed paperwork sorted, a lease drawn up, a guardianship question answered. Dawson never had to ask her twice. Some debts, it turned out, ran both directions once you started counting them honestly. Winter came hard that year, the way it always did on the down east coast. Dawson spent most evenings in the keeper's quarters he'd restored at the base of the tower. A small stone room with a wood stove and a desk where he kept the ledger, the letter, and the photographs Gus had brought him, not hidden away anymore. Displayed plain on a shelf where he could see them every morning. He still carried the roll of electrical tape in his jacket pocket, though he used it less now. Mostly out of habit. Mostly because some things you keep carrying long after they've stopped being necessary. Simply because they remind you who taught you to carry them in the first place. He'd started keeping his own ledger by then too, cloth-bound, matching the one his grandfather had used, recording weather and tides, and in the margins, the ordinary details of a life that had turned out steady after all, against every likelihood a caseworker's file might have predicted. Some nights he read back through his grandfather's ledger just to hear the old man's rhythm again. The clipped weather notes, the occasional line that broke into something bigger, something felt, before snapping shut again into fact and figure. He understood that rhythm now in a way he hadn't at first. It was the sound of a man who'd learned to say almost everything sideways, through action, through record keeping. Saying it straight had cost him too much once already. Dawson found himself writing the same way without meaning to. A line about the tide, then a line buried in the margin about missing a mother he was only now getting to know. In the spring after the relighting, Priya helped Dawson file a formal search request through the state's Vital Records office, hoping to locate Marisol Locke, or whatever name she carried now, if she was still alive at all. The search took months and returned little at first. A name change, recorded in Portland in 1991, from Marisol Locke to Marisol Reyes, following what the record listed only as a marriage. No forwarding address beyond that. The trail going the particular kind of quiet that happens when someone builds a whole new life specifically to leave an old one behind. Dawson wasn't sure some weeks whether he wanted the search to succeed. He'd spent 18 years without a mother. He'd built slowly a version of stability that didn't depend on her showing up. Part of him worried that finding her would only prove what he'd always privately feared, that something about him, even as an infant, had been easy to leave. Walt, when Dawson admitted that fear one evening on the gallery deck, was quiet a long moment before he answered. Your grandfather feared the exact same thing his whole life, Walt said. Feared it was something about him that drove her off. Something he'd done wrong raising her. Spent 40 years, never once considering the simpler explanation. That a scared 19-year-old girl in a town this small sometimes runs from shame that isn't even hers to carry. Shame other people hand her, and she just doesn't yet have the tools to put it down before she goes. He looked over at Dawson. I don't know what you'll find if that search ever turns up an address, but I bet good money it has less to do with you than you're afraid it does. The search eventually did turn up an address, in late summer. A small town outside Bangor. A phone number attached to a Marisol Reyes who would be, by the record's math, exactly the right age. Dawson didn't call right away. He sat with the number for 2 full weeks. The same way he'd sat with the letter before he could bring himself to open it. The same way he'd sat with the locket before he could bring himself to wear it. On a cord under his shirt, which he eventually did, quietly, telling no one but Walt. When he finally called, a woman's voice answered, cautious. The voice of someone who'd learned over the years to be careful about unfamiliar numbers. "This is going to sound strange," Dawson said. The words he'd rehearsed for 2 weeks arrived anyway in a rush he hadn't planned. "My name is Dawson Locke. I think you might be my mother." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Dawson wondered if she'd hung up. "Dawson," she said finally. Her voice broke on the second syllable of his name. "I named you that. I picked that name in a hospital room. I never got to say it out loud to anyone in 30 years. They talked for 2 hours that first call. Careful, halting in places. Both of them navigating 30 years of absence. Two people who'd each built a whole life around the other's leaving. She told him she'd left Cormorant Point pregnant and terrified of a father she was certain would never forgive the circumstances. She'd only learned it decades later, second-hand, through a cousin who still lived in town. Silas had never once said an unkind word about her leaving. He had, in fact, quietly asked after her for years, before eventually stopping, assuming wrongly that she'd wanted to be left alone for good. She told him she'd given him up for adoption through a private arrangement that fell apart within the year, the adoptive family unable to keep the placement. By the time the state took over his care, she'd already lost the legal standing to easily get him back, caught in a tangle of paperwork and shame and a young single mother's limited resources. Something Dawson, having lived his whole childhood inside that same system, understood better than most people ever could. "I thought about you every single day," she said. "I want you to know that. Not looking for you doesn't mean not thinking about you. I was ashamed, and I didn't know how to find you without admitting everything I'd done wrong. The longer I waited, the harder admitting it got." Dawson didn't tell her that first call everything Silas had left behind. The letter, the passbook, the locket with her photograph tucked against his own infant picture. He saved that for another day. 3 weeks later, she drove down to Cormorant Point herself, parked on the Breakwater Road, stood at the base of the tower her own father had kept for 40 years, looking up at a lamp burning again for the first time since she was a teenager. He showed her the letter first. She read it standing at the fence, in the same spot Dawson had stood the very first evening. She cried in a way that looked like something finally settling, after 30 years of never quite settling. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, the same way Dawson had carried it in his own jacket for months. "He never told me any of this," she said. "Not one word of it. And God, that man could have used one honest word to me in 30 years, and chose silence instead, same as he chose silence about everything that ever mattered to him." She laughed, unsteady, somewhere between grief and something warmer. "Guess you come by the quiet, honestly, from both sides." They didn't rebuild everything overnight. Some conversations stayed careful for a long while. 30 years of absence weren't undone by a single afternoon at a fence line, however much both of them might have wanted it to be that simple. But she started visiting most months, then most weeks. By the following spring, she'd taken a small apartment in town herself, close enough to walk to the point most evenings, close enough to sit with Dawson and Walt on the gallery deck and watch the light sweep the water in its old patient rhythm. Cole, the 17-year-old the fund had brought in that first winter, ended up staying in Cormorant Point too, working his way up from sweeping floors to a genuine apprenticeship with the mason who'd repointed the seawall, learning a trade the way Dawson had once learned to fix things quietly in 100 rooms that weren't his own. That second winter he asked Dawson something, whether he thought Silas Locke would have approved of a stranger's kid getting handed a piece of his legacy. He built the whole thing out of quiet kindness to people he never expected anything back from. Dawson told him, "I think that's exactly what he'd have wanted it to keep doing." On the anniversary of the auction, 1 full year later, the whole harbour gathered again at the point. The same crowd that had watched the relighting, now settling into something closer to a yearly custom. Marisol came. She stood at the fence in a coat too thin for the wind, the same fence where Dawson had stood alone that very first evening. Walt brought coffee for everyone, the way he always did. Cole helped Gus set up folding chairs along the Breakwater Road. Ansel closed the store early without anyone having to ask him twice. At dusk, Dawson climbed the tower stairs and switched the light on at exactly 8 o'clock. He came back down and stood between his mother and Walt. The beam swept steady over the dark water above them.